Welcome, everyone, to the Refugee and Migration Workshop. I'm Stephen Wilkinson. I'm the director of the Macmillan Centre, within which the program is located. It gives me my very great pleasure today to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Nicholas Sambanis, to present on his work on overcoming discrimination. Professor Sambanis is a leading authority in international relations. He's written really foundational works on civil war and peace and conflict and intervening to preserve peace. And more recently, his interests have also moved towards looking at domestic politics and overcoming discrimination around the world, and especially in Europe. And that's what he's going to be speaking on today. And he's recently published this book, Native Bias, Overcoming Discrimination Against Immigrants, which, as we know, is timely really everywhere in the world. So we welcome also the people who are watching online. You can submit questions in the chat and have a chance to have Professor Sambanis answer those in the Q&A. So welcome, Professor Sambanis.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I was asked to present this book that was co-authored with Choi and Mathias Poertner, who are postdoctoral fellows at my lab, the Identity Conflict Lab at Penn, and now assistant professors at Brown and LSE respectively. And the topic of the conversation today and of the book is on strategies to reduce native bias against immigrants, Muslim immigrants in particular in Europe. And the title of the conversation of the presentation, as you can see, is "Can Shared Norms of Good Citizenship Reduce Native Immigrant Conflict?" And we're motivated to study this topic by the observations that are being made constantly around Europe, that natives are actually opposed to immigration. You see in your screen here data from several countries in Europe with people responding to the question that there are so many immigrants living here that it doesn't feel like home anymore. And you see that in Italy, France, and Germany, for example, about half of the population agrees with that statement. In Greece, where I'm from, 85% of the population in a survey that was done, I believe, in 2020, would agree with the statement that the number of immigrants is too large. And the percentage agreeing among the young people, age 17 to 34, who are usually more liberal, more accepting than older people, is 70%, which is huge. And 56% of the population believe that immigrants are actually negative, have a negative impact on the economy, which is strange because there are entire sectors of the Greek economy that just do not operate without migrant labor, like agriculture and tourism and construction, for example. And 84% prefer all refugees who arrived at the 2015 refugee crisis to leave Greece. These are pretty staggering numbers, suggesting hostility towards immigrants. And one of the objectives of this book and of the broader project that I'll talk to you about today is to uncover the causes of immigrant bias and then to consider potential strategies to reduce that. So there's a very large literature in political science on this topic, particularly on causes of native bias and causes of prejudice in general towards all kinds of minority groups, not just immigrants. And I've organized them here in a list of, so the three dominant explanations are, one, that it might be racism and just xenophobia, prejudice towards any group that is not part of the in-group and is culturally or different with respect to any kind of respective characteristics. And there is some evidence of this, both with respect to immigrant groups, but also other minority groups. A second, very popular explanation is that economic competition between natives and immigrants is what explains hostility towards immigrants. This is a very popular explanation in the United States, and also in Europe. But interestingly, there is very little evidence to support this, from cross-country studies. So the least likely explanation is that one, as far as the literature is concerned at the moment. And then the third and the most likely explanation for what causes bias against immigrants is that cultural differences between the native population and the immigrant groups create the perception of threat. And that is what motivates natives to react against immigration, because they perceive immigrants as potentially changing the national identity, right? So they see the symbols of cultural difference of immigrants. In this picture here, it's the hijab that these women are wearing as a symbol of change that is unwelcome in native society. So the theory that we develop in the book is grounded in social psychological theories of intergroup conflict that are not specific to native immigrant relations, but we extend those to some extent, and we apply insights from these literatures. And what I have here in bold is the statement that conflict over waves of life is at the heart of opposition to multiculturalism in Europe. That's I think, the theoretical perspective that has received the most support in survey-based and experimental research in political science in Europe. And the reason is that natives have priors and stereotypes about the extent to which immigrants live by different rules and different norms, and also the extent to which these norms are just different from their own. And that generates social distance between natives and immigrants, right? So the larger that social distance, the larger the bias, and that's an insight that comes out of the literature in social psychology that I mentioned earlier. And Native Bias, the book that I'm presenting today, tests the power of shared norms and ideas to reduce expressions of native immigrant hostility by reducing the perception of social distance separating these groups. So, and in an ongoing, the book is out already, so I'll present the empirical results from the book, but I'll also at the end discuss some extensions that I have ongoing currently. Right? So I mentioned that the theoretical foundation of the book lies in social psychology literature that goes back decades, in particular social identity theory, and which has taught us that any kind of ascriptive or other group-based difference can generate bias, even if those differences are not felt deeply and they don't have bias. So we can create artificial groups in the lab and assign people to these groups, and that will generate hostility and competition between the two groups. And a lot of that literature has then gone on to try to figure out ways to reduce bias and reduce conflict between groups. Expressions, versions of those arguments have found their way in political science. And there are some arguments out there about ways to reduce conflict between natives and immigrants that require immigrants to assimilate completely to native society by shedding the markers of their difference, right? So assimilating by adapting names that are not visibly foreign, for example, or changing their religion. So these forms of coercive assimilation are juxtaposed to the types of strategies that we're considering in this book, which are far less coercive and which consist of converging on a set of norms of good citizenship that, if applied, if used and implemented in everyday settings, both by natives and immigrants, can generate the perception that everyone is part of a common in-group, a citizen in-group. And by doing so, that should reduce the import of ascriptive markers and cultural differences that can persist, right? So in other words, if immigrants behave in ways that natives perceived as not threatening vis-a-vis norms and values that they share, then they should no longer care about any visible markers of difference, racial, ethnic, religious, or other markers that immigrants might have. And therefore, there should be less pressure for immigrants to assimilate by shedding those markers. That's the idea here. And by the way, you can jump in with questions anytime you like in the presentation. So the data for this book comes from experiments that we ran in Germany between 2018 and 2019, and for the field experiments, and expanded later with some survey experiments in 2020 and 2021. We chose Germany because it was one of two countries that were most affected by the refugee crisis of 2015, the other one being Greece. And Germany received more than 1.5 million applications for asylum after the Syrian refugee crisis. And over a long period, even prior to 2015, there was growing opposition to multiculturalism. But it's not the most anti-immigrant nation in Europe. Italy and Hungary probably hold that distinction right now, at least. Germany is about in the middle. Like if you look at indices of opposition to multiculturalism in Europe, Germany is roughly in the middle, right? So it's a large country that's important. It has a very large population of migrants going back generations since the post-war period when they had the worker program. And so it has had a lot of experience with foreign populations, and it was hit really hard in this recent crisis. Therefore, it's a good case study. And what we did to generate data for this project is that we created what we call microenvironments of social interactions designed to observe the degree of assistance that is offered to strangers in everyday interactions. Right? So we focus on everyday settings in which people interact with each other, because we feel that this gives us a glimpse into the types of information that people receive about others, information about the extent to which one is accepted or excluded in society. Right? So the idea is that if you observe a stranger offering you help in one instance, and this happens many, many times, over time, that will generate that will shape your perceptions of the degree to which you're accepted as an equal in that society. So these everyday settings that we analyze in this project are interactions in train stations, actually, platforms when people wait the train to go to work or travel. Germany has many large cities with many large stations, and there are stations with like 20, 30, 21 or 24 platforms. So, and people just gather there, and there's a constant stream of new people who sit for a while and then leave, and that gives us access to a lot of bystanders whose behavior we can observe in real time in a real setting after exposing them to an experiment, an intervention that they do not know is artificial and is set up by us. So I'm going to present two experiments of this sort here, plus a bunch of survey experiments that we did to tease apart specific mechanisms that can explain the results from the field experiments. The first one consists of a staged violation of the norm against littering, which Germans care a lot about. Actually, another reason why Germany is a good case for this analysis is because they care a lot about rules, right? So rule following is a norm in its own right, no matter what kind of rule. So if you ride the bike at night in Germany without a light, people will scream at you from everywhere. Right? If you cross the street, people will yell at you from both sides of the street. If you have a child while you cross the street, they're going to scream even more. You know? So it's a good test case. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to compare it a little bit to Greece, which is precisely the opposite. People in general don't follow norms. They don't really care if you follow the norms, and no one is going to intervene to make sure that you follow the norm. So we have a multi-country study that we're developing now with Eleni Kirkopoulou, who's a postdoc associated with my lab. He's an economist based in Greece, and Chris Krakowski, who's an assistant professor at King's College. That makes cross-country comparisons of the sort that I'm going to talk to you about today, but today I will only focus on German. So I'm going to present the setup of the experiment really briefly. I'll show you some footage, and then I'll show you the results, and then I'll move on to the next one. So in this experiment, we care about these guys, experimental subjects, which are basically ordinary Germans waiting in the train station to get on a train, basically. They can be standing, they can be sitting. And a member of our team, always male, will come in and violate the norm against littering by dropping a cup, paper cup with coffee. Doesn't have coffee in it, but he's just finished it. We'll drop it on the platform. And then another member of our team, always a woman, will, in some cases, intervene to tell this guy to pick up his trash, basically. And please place the paper in a trash can, thereby signaling to those people here that she cares about norms, about cleanliness, and about the country, basically. Right? Then this team member will take a call. Okay, someone will call her, and she will have a conversation that is loud enough for these people here to hear. And in the next step, she will drop a bunch of possessions that she's cradling in a paper bag. The possessions are groceries, oranges, actually. The bag is torn at the bottom, and she's instructed to make a sudden move, drop her bag, which will force her to move her arm, and then the oranges will fall on the floor, they will disperse on the ground, and we observe whether these guys help her pick them up. That's the setup. Right? I'm going to go back into the details, and I'll tell you which are the experimental dimensions that we manipulate in a little bit. But first, I'll show you a video of this interaction. If I can figure out how to start it. There we go. This is Danilo, political science student. Drop this cup, and that's Nestle, she's Turkish. You see these women here already talking about it. This woman here is working with us, and she's going to record their reactions. And this one also. We have two coders working with the team. Throw him off. The three women are talking about him. This guy doesn't care. Now she's taking her call. And she's talking to her friend about coming to see her. Now she's instructed not to pick up these oranges for 5 seconds, so that we can give these people a chance to pick them up. So this woman here and the other one who you saw was standing on that side have recorded some information. First of all, they recorded the number of bystanders who were sitting, whether they were sitting or not, the gender of the bystanders, a subjective estimate of their age. Are they old or young? Basically, can they get up and help or not, basically. And some other things, like is anybody on a wheelchair, cane, all that. And most importantly, did anybody help, right? So our main outcome in the study is, did anyone help this woman pick up her oranges? And also how many people helped is a secondary outcome, right? So that's the intervention, basically, right? And the key here is that these people didn't know that they were part of an experiment. We believe that by generating these situations and collecting data this way, we get a more organic and true estimate of the willingness to help than it would be the case if we just asked them in a survey, would you help somebody in need? In fact, we've done this, and there's a massive difference between the stated willingness to help people and the actual help that they provide. Now, what's the experiment manipulating, right? So there are 3 dimensions: the identity of the confederate, the language of the phone call, and norm enforcement. So in the first treatment dimension, we manipulate the ascriptive characteristics of the female confederate who does the norm enforcement. Here you see Stephanie, who's German, and is our native control in this study, and Emel, who is Kurdish, and she was actually a refugee in Turkey and became a student. Now, here you'll see that Emel is wearing a hijab in one condition, no hijab. She's basically dressed the same way that Stephanie is dressed. the way most women of her age are dressed in Germany, students. And then here, she's wearing a big cross, like George Michael level cross, that's very visible from far away to signal that she's Christian, right? So the idea here is that social distance between Emil and Stephanie increases as you go this direction, right, from right to left. And our hypothesis, drawing from social identity theory, which says that there is in-group bias whenever you highlight group differences between two groups, is that Emil is going to get much less help in this condition here compared to the other two conditions where she's visibly less distant from the native control. But she will, in all cases, we expect her to receive less help than Stephanie. The second dimension that we manipulate is norm enforcement, right? So I won't go through this whole thing again. We'll focus on just on these two things. So as I mentioned, our female punisher will sometimes enforce the norm, tell the guy to pick up his trash. Other times, she won't do anything. She won't care, basically. She will just sit there and look at the trash and then mind her own business. There's always enforcement in these experiments, right? So there is another team member who is also a woman who comes in and tells, so somebody always tells this guy to pick up his trash. And we did that for two reasons. First, in Germany, somebody's going to tell this guy to pick up his trash anyway. So we wanted to do it first before there's intervention by the bystanders. And second, there is a literature in psychology. I'm not sure how robust the findings are, that there are these spillover effects by observing positive behavior, for example. So if you observe something prosocial, somebody doing something nice, then you might also respond in a nice way on an entirely different matter, So we wanted to keep the observation of prosocial behavior constant throughout these experiments, because what we really care about was whether differences in the identity of the person making the experiment, making the norm enforcement really drives the results. So we always had someone enforcing the norm, right? Yes.
Maybe I'm anticipating a little bit, but would you run the experiment also with different gender for the violator and the punisher?
Yeah, so that's a question that we get a lot, and it would be neat to do that. We didn't do that because there were 14 conditions in this experiment. So then it would have gotten just blown up logistically. And that's actually the reason why in these extensions that I'm going to talk about at the end, we use calibrated adaptations of these interventions in a survey-based setting that is much more cost-effective and allows us to check these variations. We chose women here because we thought that it was less likely that there's going to be trouble, basically. Like if you had a woman littering and a Muslim immigrant man telling her off, that could have been a dangerous situation in some of the towns that we went to, for example. But nobody is going to be violent against a woman who's actually behaving in a prosocial way and enforcing the norm. It would be pretty crazy, actually, and it never happened. So that was the reason why we did this. But obviously, and I think also helping behavior tends to be higher baseline for women than it would be for men. Some guy drops his oranges, like pick them up and stuff. So these were the reasons why we did that. Now the third dimension, which I won't talk much about in this presentation, as part of the experiment, nonetheless, is the language of the phone call. Right? So the woman who was holding the oranges and either made the intervention to enforce the norm or not, always took a call. Actually, the guy who was leaving was the one calling her, and she spoke to him in either in German or in Arabic or Turkish. Okay, and always had the same script that we gave her, basically, which was about, oh, I'm excited to come see you. It was something irrelevant, basically, and the whole idea, it was was to make the call sound like she's talking to a friend. And therefore, if she's talking to a friend in German, that means that she has German friends. And therefore, she's assimilated to some extent, and her network includes Germans, right? Which you would expect if it's a native, but you might not expect if she's a hijab-wearing Middle Eastern woman, right? And that could also influence behavior. So that's the experiment. Now, where did we do this? We did this in train stations in 31 cities and towns across 3 states, in former East Germany and in West Germany here, right? So there were 34 Confederates across 7 teams. And these blue dots here are the different cities. And we were fortunate that Germany has so many cities with train stations that we can do this. I have pilots going on now in Greece where I'm trying to do something like this, and it's like impossible, basically. And so we're doing it in like bus stations and metro stations, and every public space you can imagine. And it's crazy complicated logistically, right? So we ran the intervention 1,614 times, and altogether that involved a little more than 7,000 bystanders. And we had 14 treatment and control conditions when you combine the manipulations for the 3 dimensions, which is why we didn't have male enforcers, for example, or consider other potentially interesting variations of this. So the main outcome, as I mentioned, was, did any bystander offer assistance? And there are logistical details of the skit, basically, which I won't get into, but you can't drop the orange here and expect somebody from way down there to run and get it, although that happened once. This little girl sprinted across, like 20 meters to try to help, but they had to be within 3 meters, basically, right? More or less. And the oranges had to be on the ground for a few seconds, not so long that it becomes weird that you haven't bent down to pick them up yourself, but long enough to give people a chance to pick them up. Plus there was like a long protocol about, what counts as help, what doesn't. The results I'm going to show you here refer to whether this binary indicator, whether any bystander helped or not. And in this experiment, we only did it in settings where there were multiple bystanders, right? Never just one-on-one. In the next experiment that I'm going to show you, we also did one-on-one interactions. And that kind of matters, actually. So the hypothesis, as I mentioned, is that just flows straight out of social psychological theories of social identity, is that people will receive less assistance from bystanders if they're different. And the more different they are, the less assistance they will receive. These are the first 2. And that signaling cultural integration by enforcing valued civic norms will offset the bias that we anticipate finding against Muslim immigrant enforcers, Muslim immigrants. These are the main hypotheses. So I won't talk about any technical details in this presentation. I'll just show some bar graphs, basically, but we can discuss details if you want. One of the main results is that there is bias against immigrants on the basis of religion in Germany. The blue column here shows you that providing help is fairly common, right? 78% of the cases, there was some help given to the Confederate. When the Confederate was a German native woman. And it wasn't much different when it was an immigrant woman wearing a cross or an immigrant woman in the control condition, dressed in modern clothes, looking secular, basically, right? So these first 3 columns here suggest that phenotypical differences, just looking like you're not really German, basically, whatever that means, or whatever people think of Germanness, doesn't really matter very much in Germany, nor does the language actually matter, which is very interesting, because in other countries, in particular in the United States, other experiments have shown that they matter a lot, right? So there's an interesting experiment done by Ryan Enos at Harvard in Boston, where he shows that even just planting some Confederates who are Latinos and they look visibly Latino in subway stations, generates more hostile attitudes towards affirmative action among the commuters, for example. So even seeing someone who's different racially and listening to Spanish can generate hostile responses in the United States, not in Germany, which suggests that they're actually much more okay with cultural differences and ethnic difference, which is what you would expect when you have such a large foreign worker population. Of course, you would expect the same thing in the United States, but it's not. It's not. Now, this is interesting here. If you compare columns 3 and 4, you see the penalty that women incur out of just showing that they believe different things than the average German believes by wearing the hijab. So on average, immigrant women wearing hijab get help 66% of the time, which is pretty good, more than half the time, but much less, significantly less than the same woman not wearing a hijab, right? Who gets help 76% of the time. There's a 10% difference, and that's the amount of the penalty basically that you get from being different in this everyday interaction. You might say, well, 10% is that a lot? I don't know if it's a lot, but it is what we picked up. And it's also a fairly costless way of helping someone, right? Like it's for someone who is like not have a bad back or something, it's nothing to bend down and pick up an orange, especially if the orange hits your leg or it's really closer to you than somebody else. So to withhold that assistance systematically towards someone on the basis of what they look like, what you think they believe, is a significant expression of hostility, we think. That's how we interpret this. Now, does norm enforcement change these results in some way, right? So we find that actually bias is partially offset by shared norms, but it's not completely eliminated, right? So here, starting again by German enforcer, we see that they get helped about 84% of the time, significantly more than the previous data that I showed you. And there is a statistically significant difference in the amount of help that the German native gets when she enforces a norm versus not, right? So she gets more help when she enforces the norm. When the immigrant wearing a hijab enforces the norm, she also gets much more help than when she does not. There is now a 12.5% difference, right? So the hijab penalty increases when there is also enforcement versus non-enforcement. But an interesting finding is that the amount of help that the immigrant woman wearing a hijab gets when she enforces the norm is basically the same as the amount of help that the German woman gets when she does not enforce the norm. So this is an example of what you hear frequently being said in the United States and other countries, which is that minorities and immigrants have to work twice as hard to get basically the same kind of treatment that natives get, right? So like these women get help the same way, but this Middle Eastern woman here wearing a hijab has gone out of her way to confront this big German dude, for being rude, whereas this woman is just white, and they get help the same. So while we see this increase, right, from 60% to 73%, and is statistically significant, and therefore we know that pro-social behavior by immigrants is recognized. There's still a difference in difference, basically, and native women still get help more, right? This is not trivial, though, right? Because it could have been the case that norm enforcement was completely discounted when done by an immigrant, right? So, and we didn't find it. So it could have been the case that these columns were equal, right? So maybe people and the fact that they're not suggests that Germans actually value norm enforcement and rules more than the antipathy that many of them feel towards other people. Or it suggests that the reason that they have this antipathy might be that they make assumptions about the things that immigrants actually believe. Right? So when you resolve that uncertainty and you show them that they actually share the same ideas to some extent, that the negative attitude toward immigrants is reduced. So that's the main result.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
Now, this third person, when she tells the guy to pick up his trash, I assume she has to speak
German. In German, with a slight accent.
Okay.
Slight accent. Yes. So now you might wonder why are so what drives this? What is the mechanism basically? Why do people what do people think about when they see an immigrant woman either reacting prosocially by telling the guy to pick up his trash or not caring basically when she stands right next to somebody who litters? So to figure that out, because we didn't have data on this from our field experiment, we ran a survey experiment in maybe a few months later, I believe in 2020, where we showed videos from these interventions and pictures of littered streets and collected data on basically beliefs about littering, about why Germans litter, why immigrants litter, who litters more, and so on. And we found out that the majority of Germans think that immigrants litter more than Germans. And when you ask them why, in an open-ended response, and you do a little word cloud of their responses, you see that this word homeland and respect and habit is what comes up more frequently in spontaneous responses about, why do immigrants litter? They litter because they're not from here. This isn't their homeland. They don't really care. They don't have the habit not to litter, right? Which suggests that it's all about respect and showing respect and affinity for the new country, right? So and that is what registers when they observe an immigrant woman enforcing the norm, that she actually does care and she respects the country that she lives in now. And therefore, she can be considered part of the citizen in-group. But on the basis of this experiment, that is not enough to eliminate all bias, right? Because there's still a difference in the results I showed you. So so far we've learned that Germans discriminate against Muslims in everyday interactions to some extent, that ethno-linguistic differences and phenotypical differences don't really matter. And therefore this discrimination must be driven by what people read into these descriptive differences, right? What do they think the hijab means, for example? And that these perceptions of normative differences with immigrants that underlie that bias can be manipulated. And when you change them, that can reduce the bias, but not eliminate it. So what are the mechanisms underlying this again, right? So social psychological theory, in particular common in-group identity model, which was developed by Gardner and Dovidio, who is here at Yale, suggests some possible explanations and mechanisms. Two mechanisms that they have suggested is recategorization and decategorization, right? So the idea is that you can reduce prejudice towards someone else if you can redefine that person as a member of a common in-group, right? Rather than a member of a hostile out-group. What can this common in-group be when we're dealing with natives and immigrants? It can't be a national in-group, but it could be a citizen in-group, right? So the idea that we had here is that if everyone behaves the same way and they show that they share the same ideas about standards of appropriate civic behavior, they can be part of a shared citizen in-group. And that is the way that they can be recategorized as an in-group member from an out-group member. Or a different mechanism is that they can be decategorized as a member of a hostile out-group by considering these people as not typical members of that hostile out-group. right? So you could look at the person, the immigrant woman with the hijab who's enforcing the norm, and think of her as a citizen, a good citizen, not as a Muslim. Or you can look at her and say, yeah, yes, she's a Muslim, but she's a good Muslim, not a bad Muslim like the others, basically, right? So the first will be recategorization, the second will be decategorization mechanism. So, and a third, and we wanted to test these mechanisms, and a third thing that we wanted to test is whether the benefit of prosocial behavior that is generated by observing norm enforcement by one person generalizes to the group, or is it restricted to the person itself, right? So to do that, we ran another survey experiment, which consisted of showing people videos, right? Now, this video here was filmed by us, and it was as if randomly captured on the phone, right? So Mathias was sitting here in a bench, and he was taking a video with his phone of the surroundings in the back, right? And he was saying, "Oh, look, they finished the construction in the station." You know, how the way people do all the time, and then they post the stuff on YouTube or TikTok, right? And then as he was doing that, these people walk into the frame, right? And then we repeated this intervention, not the norm enforcement, just the littering. I'm sorry, not the oranges part, just the norm violation and the enforcement, right? So this guy, who's pretty huge actually, and you wouldn't want to tell him off, without police around you or something, drops his cup, and then this woman, who's pretty small, actually tells him to pick up his trash, or not, So in one iteration, she just sits there, and actually her friends are sitting just off that frame. There were some versions in which there were a group of four, and other versions in which she was alone. So we have an experiment again in which norm violation is either sanctioned or not sanctioned by a woman who is either a Muslim woman wearing a hijab or a German woman, right? So we have videos of all of these different conditions, and we upload them on YouTube in an account and channel that we created. We let them sit there for a while, and then we use the link in a survey instrument saying, look, we want to know what you think about these situations, which we found online, including this video that we happen to find online. So it's as if it's a real intervention that we captured in the field, and we implement the survey in a sample of 2,500 German adults in November 2020. And we are interested in measuring responses using this item, basically. So after they view the video, they're asked to consider whether the person in the video is similar, and how similar that person is to an upstanding German citizen, right? Are they 0% similar, 20% similar, 40%, and so on until identical, basically, right? This is a common way of measuring perceived similarity in the American politics literature and in economics. And we call this the recategorization item, because the idea is that if the person in question is an immigrant wearing a hijab, and you think that she is 100% similar to a good upstanding citizen, then you're thinking about her as a citizen rather than as a foreigner, right? Because an upstanding German citizen would have done exactly what a person did in the iterations where they enforced the norm, right? So I won't show you all the analysis. I'll just give you a snapshot of the results. And the results are that norm enforcers are seen as more similar to good German citizens, regardless of whether they wear a hijab or no hijab. The hijab no longer matters, basically, right? So we have a very large shift from 0 to 100, although it's not 100 again. And norm enforcers, so we have evidence of the recategorization mechanism. And norm enforcers are seen as not typical members of their group, right? when the norm enforcer is an immigrant, right? So a Muslim woman enforcing the norm is seen as more similar to a good German citizen, and because she's not a typical Muslim, right? So that's these are the main results here. And the benefit of norm enforcement, seeing this norm enforcement in the video doesn't change your views of Muslims as a group in general, right? So yes, you recognize that this one person did something good. Yes, he's closer to a good German citizen, but Muslims as a whole are still as bad or as good as you thought about previously, right? So there is evidence of both recategorization and decategorization, and this one-shot intervention that we did in the video doesn't really change perceptions of the group in general. That might also be true, is probably true in the field as well. So seeing somebody doing something good in the field who's from a different outgroup is probably not going to change your worldview about everybody else. But our hypothesis is that if you were to see examples of such prosocial behavior over and over again by many different people everywhere, that should over time change your views. But that's still untested. So now you might ask, well, what about other norms? Okay, so we talked about littering, but littering is kind of a generic, not littering is a generic civic norm. Everybody kind of feels the same way about it. It's hard to find someone who's going to tell you in a survey, yes, I'd like to litter, you know. But maybe we'll have, maybe the reason that we find that the diff in diff still there is because enforcing a non-littering norm has shallow effects, right? You'll give somebody the benefit of saying that you feel a little closer to that person because they enforce the norm, but it's not going to change the way you feel about that person massively. What about if we focus on group-specific norms? And by that, we mean civic norms that affect your subgroup of the population more, right? To do these generate stronger effects. And here we focus on gender equity and norms about gender roles in particular. And we expect that, we hypothesize that the reason that women wearing a hijab in Germany get penalized and discriminated against in these public settings is because people make assumptions about their beliefs regarding gender equality. To see a hijab, they assume that the woman is regressive vis-a-vis gender equality norms, and they punish her for that by not helping her when she needs help. What if we actually were able to communicate the woman's beliefs about gender roles in the same way that we did in the previous experiment? Would that change things in the field? So we designed another experiment that tested exactly that, right? So our hypothesis is that discrimination against Muslims is likely driven by beliefs that they have regressive ideas about gender. That is a big topic, actually, in immigration, studies of immigration in Europe. Gender and the role of women in society, in Muslim societies versus Christian societies, is a point of conflict and debate. So we confirm, actually, that this assumption is widely shared in Germany in a standard survey. So we tell them, what do you think about hijab, for example? And repression is what comes immediately as the most commonly mentioned word in this survey. So we said, well, what if Muslim women signal that they actually have progressive ideas about German? Does that reduce discrimination? And does that make the hijab just an irrelevant cultural symbol that they wear for other reasons, right? Rather than to signal political ideology that is contrary to the dominant view in Germany. And we did that with another field experiment the following summer 2019, which had the same idea, but we dropped lemons this time, so rather than oranges, right? So here is Nestle. She's the same woman that you saw before. She loved being part of this whole thing, so she re-upped this. The second, she lived in Cologne, and she was a political science student. She's Turkish. So she approaches a group of people who could be standing or talking or sitting, and she takes a call, right? And in the call, she will reveal her beliefs about gender equality. And I'll tell you how. So we manipulate two dimensions here. The first is the identity of the Confederate, just like in the previous one. She can be a German native. This is Charlotte. She was in one of the East German teams. And this is Ranim, who's a Syrian refugee. And here is Ranim in the control condition wearing no hijab. And here is Ranim wearing hijab, basically, right? So we have three conditions: immigrant hijab, immigrant no hijab, and native. And these women dressed depending on the way that the condition that they were assigned to suggest they should be dressed, would approach this group and have a conversation in which they reveal their views on gender by saying one of these three things. So in one condition, she will speak. She's always speaking to a friend of hers, and she's expressing her emotional state about a decision that her sister took to either take a job or not, right? So in the regressive condition message, she says, "Hi, thanks for calling back. I'm really mad. My sister's a terrible mother." There's a word for that in German that people really pay attention to when they listen to it, like raven mother. Although I don't know if ravens are bad mothers or not. She prefers to work instead of looking after her children and her husband at home. And then there's a pause. And then she says, "I think that as a woman, she should stay at home and look after her family. I've never been so mad since we moved to Germany." We added this sentence to make clear that these people were actually immigrants or recent immigrants, because that wasn't actually clear in the first experiment. And then in the progressive message, it's the same setting. The sister takes a job or not, but she's happy about that, right? So a woman, "I'm really happy, very proud of my sister. She decided to go to work. She shouldn't just stay at home to look after her children and husband." And the control condition, she basically has a similar length conversation with a friend about some relevant subject. "Oh, I'm coming to see you. I'm excited." Blah blah blah. Right. So.
And what does the control person say then regarding Germany?
She says, "I'm happy. I'm happy to come to see you." And then something happened in her life. I can't remember what we said now. And then it ends with basically the same thing. I'm happy. So she's happy in the control, happy in the progressive, and mad in the regressive. Now, the data collection here lasted 5 weeks, 25 cities in 26 train stations in NRW, Saxony, and Lower Saxony. And here we repeated this iteration 1,830 times, and we had almost 4,000 bystanders, right? Again, within 3 meters. In a pilot, the spring before, Mathias and I went to Frankfurt, and we ran this like about 250 times. And we then had a team of people come and interview everybody who was around. So we established that in like 98% of the times, they noticed the Confederate, 96% of the time, they noticed the call, and 86% of the times, they could tell you exactly what she said, even when they were wearing headphones, which is pretty weird, I think, but it is what it is, you know? So very nosy people who want to know what's going on around them, which works for this experiment quite well. So here we collect data on how many bystanders there were, and we collect, in this instance, we were better at it. So we had individual level data. We had up to 7 bystanders, and then for each bystander, what's the gender of that person? Were they wearing headphones? What is the subjective estimate of the age bracket? Are they potentially of immigrant background? That's all subjective, obviously. And did this bystander offer assistance? And that allows us to analyze the data both by iteration. Did anybody help in that iteration or not? But also to say something about, did women help more or not? And that was useful because after the intervention, we had a survey. Another team came in a few minutes later, and said, oh, we're from this university in this town, we're running the survey, doing the study, can we do a survey about social issues in Germany? It was extremely hard to get people to say yes to that, unfortunately, and we didn't really get great data. We tried everything, tried giving away $2,000. We tried this weird system where we gave them these cards and we could track them so they can actually take the survey later when they wanted to, and they never went basically. But we have some data that we can actually match with the individual level data, and that gives us some interesting findings actually. So the first result is that we replicate the finding from the previous summer, which is that there is bias on the basis of religion, right? We have the average level of help is about the same, 76%. It was 78% in 2018 for the native, and it's basically the same for the immigrant control. No discrimination there, but it's 67.5% for the immigrant with a hijab, and that difference is statistically significant. It's exactly the same as before. And here's the interesting stuff here. So lots of dimensions here to consider. The first dimension is just compare the bluish columns with the reddish columns. And we see that the bluish columns, which are all about natives, the different conditions, progressive, neutral, or regressive in the natives, are all about the same. Whereas there are differences in immigrants. So basically, what these native women say doesn't really influence whether they get help or not. So, whereas for immigrants, it matters quite a bit whether they appear to be progressive or regressive, right? And the progressive woman wearing a hijab gets helped just as much. There's no statistically significant difference as the German woman in any condition, right? So there's no longer any bias towards Muslim women when they appear to be regressive. And that result is driven by women, German women. German women no longer discriminate against Muslim women when the Muslim woman appears to be progressive. There is a significant penalty to wearing hijab when it is associated in confirming the priors that this woman is regressive. But there is no analogous penalty to being regressive if you're German. Right? So that in and of itself can be interpreted as a subtle sign of bias, right? So basically, white German women are allowed to have whatever views they have, and you'll still help them. But the Muslim women, that's not the case, basically, right? So you help them only if they show you that they believe the same thing that you believe. Now, men are not affected at all by this intervention, right? It doesn't change their reaction. In fact, they discriminate a little more against women in the progressive condition and the regressive condition relative to the control. Like whenever they talk, basically, it upsets them a little bit, and they help them a little less. But it's only a very, very small annoyance penalty. Right? So, but they don't care basically if the Muslim women are regressive. So there's something else that's driving male discrimination against Muslim women. And the third finding, which comes from the individual level data, is that this entire set of results comes from secular women. There's a 50 percentage points difference in the help rate among women who declare to be religious and women who declare to be atheist. And the atheist, the secular women in Germany are the ones who appreciate the progressive message. Christian women do not. In fact, sometimes punish the German women for that position. Right? Just as in the previous example, we follow up with a survey experiment to figure out exactly why do people discriminate against the hijab wearing women. And we ran a survey showing them a video of one of our Confederates when she wears a hijab, who drops her oranges in front of these German people, and nobody helps her. And we asked them, why do you think she doesn't get any help? And the most common explanation, like at 65% of the people give you immediately, is that it's because they think that she does not think that women are equal, and they think women should be subordinate, right? So the whole idea here is that when people look at the hijab as a symbol of Islam, they assume that it's a symbol of political Islam, and that it means that it represents a set of politically regressive beliefs, which can, if you allow a lot of Muslims to come in and live in Germany, shape the politics of the country and causing backtracking on advances in women's rights that have occurred over time, right? So that's the explanation that we believe drives the results that we find. And men are not responsive to this because they don't really care that much about the progress that is made in women's rights, because they don't really benefit from it. Just to close, basically, because I'll tell you where this is going. So we're interested in these questions. Does race play a role? What if the enforcer is male? What if we're talking about other norms? Not just littering and gender equity. It's extremely complicated to do this in the field, and these experiments are massively complicated logistically. So we were in the field from like 7 a.m. until 7, 8 p.m. every day for 5-6 weeks at a time. And we had 55 people working across the country, basically, for months. So it's not possible to look at these in a field experiment setting. So what we're doing now is we're creating calibrated versions of these interventions in survey experiments. And I can tell you a little more about how that is done. And the idea is to run survey experiments in all European Union countries with very large samples of about 4,000 people per country, where we measure, first, try to find out what norms do these European citizens care about among a larger set of norms that define good citizenship, rank order these norms, and create norm hierarchies for every country, and then see whether people apply these hierarchies consistently to evaluate natives and immigrants in every country. And that involves basically a two-stage process where we elicit beliefs about the norms that matter and perceptions about what other people in these countries think is the right way of behaving, right? And that will tell us whether there's an implicit consensus in the European Union, perhaps as a result of being part of the Union, about what it means to be a good citizen, and whether those norms of good citizenship are applied to judge natives and immigrants equally. So just to wrap up, we learned in this book that there are cultural differences cause bias, that coercive assimilation, changing your name or dropping the hijab might not be necessary if you can disconnect what these symbols actually mean politically from the religious or other cultural significance. But we also learned that norm enforcement and adhering to valued norms might actually not be enough to eliminate all bias. And that multiculturalism has some limits. So you can overcome ascriptive differences, but natives will resist abandoning norms and ideas that define their identities that they've developed over time and they've been socialized in for the benefit of accommodating newcomers and the values that they represent. So there are some policy implications of this research as well that we're trying to uncover now in the work that is ongoing. And one result is that there is no easy way of creating like some public information campaign that will work for everybody and reduce bias, So, and that's unfortunate, but the multidimensionality of social identities, basically, and the complicated way in which the different identities intersect, make it impossible for us to have a single message that will work well for everyone. And we saw that in the gender experiment, where the message that these women are actually progressive works very well on women, some women, secular women, but not at all among Christian women, and men are indifferent, basically, right? So imagine if you had a public information campaign, basically, that highlighted some feature of an immigrant population, it could work for a subset of the population, but not for the entire population. So it's very hard to find a scalable public information campaign that can just eliminate prejudices and misperceptions just like that. And as a first step for a policy design that actually address these issues, we think that we need to collect more information about, first, what are the priors that people have about different immigrant groups? How do they expect them to violate, to behave? Which norms do they think they will violate and which they will adhere to? And then how much do people care about the specific norms that immigrants are likely to violate? And once we have that information, we can then create citizenship classes that can inform not just immigrants, but also natives about this. They can share the information with both native populations and immigrant populations, leading to fewer misperceptions about the degree to which immigrants are norm violators, and pushing both groups towards a convergence in their public behaviors and adherence to a set of norms of good citizenship that could allow this recategorization mechanism that we described to take hold, basically. So I'll stop here.
Question online, if
Yeah.
you allow.
Sure.
If you join me thanking Professor Sambanis for this